Welcome. I am Judy Clem, and on behalf of the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory, we are delighted to welcome you to our presentation tonight on all about planting bulbs for your spring blooms. As part of the Friends mission, we want to help educate and inspire our gardeners to become more confident in their endeavors. So in addition to programs like tonight's, we have a whole fall lecture series that we're presenting. Our next program coming up in October is about the wonderful world of chili peppers, and we have the Chili Pepper Institute coming in for that. So we're very excited to have them. And then following up on that, our November lecture is going to be featuring all about the native Illinois tree, the pawpaw tree. So we will have a wonderful presentation coming up in the fall, and we'll send out information to everybody about that. I want to mention that the fall mum and bulb sale is still open. In fact, it is open online until Monday, and next Friday it will actually be in person. So things that were not pre-ordered will be available for sale. So you might get inspired from Patty's talk this evening and want to dash out and get some extra bulbs. The mums are absolutely stunning. I don't know what's going on back there, Patty, but it is mom heaven. I keep going and I take new pictures each day I'm there. So things are looking really gorgeous. And Patty will share with you what some of the bulb selection looks like for this year. And of course, we'll learn how to plant them. So let me introduce our speaker tonight. You've heard her name a lot, and I'm sure many of you know who she is. But Patti Staley is the Director of Horticulture and Conservatory Operations for the Park District of Oak Park. She has a bachelor's degree in plant and soil science from Southern Illinois University and has worked in the green industry for 25 years. Amazing. She's held positions in various parts from private and public sector, with public landscape design, project management, nursery management, and plant propagation. And her passion is creating beautiful functional spaces and connecting people with what she loves most, which is plants. I also want to introduce Casey Nickloff, who is our co-host this evening. I'm so pleased to have Casey here tonight. She's running technical and AV, and I'm so glad to have her. So Casey will also, I can tag team with you on the chat if needed, just let me know, but please put your questions into the chat and we will answer them as many as we can afterwards. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to Patty and Casey. So Casey, you're going to share screen and I'm going to spotlight Patty.
Thank you, Judy and Casey. We've had some technical difficulties getting started, but I think this will go smooth from here. But thank you everyone for joining us tonight. You know, it's very rare as the director of the conservatory that I get to spend an evening talking about plants, which I really love. And so I look forward to this. Bulbs, I have loved bulbs forever. In fact, when I started with the conservatory 11 years ago, many of you may remember Henrietta Yardling. Henrietta had a love of bulbs too, and she really just kind of like helped me catch the fever. So without further ado, let's get started. Spring bulbs, they are the art and soul of spring. They appear as beacons of new life to come. And I think we can all agree to that. Once we see those daffodils popping head, everyone gets excited. It's kind of a sigh of relief that spring is around the corner. I'd like to start off, and what we're going to do is we're just going to go through like some simple planting tips, some things maybe that you did not think about or have not considered. Kind of dive into the different groupings of bulbs, because I know when I first started really learning about bulbs, it became overwhelming. And then when I became conservatory manager, and back then we had a pretty large in-person bulb sale, it was overwhelming to me, the different bulb companies out there and selecting bulbs. And I've had some really great people in the industry that have helped me kind of navigate that. Because as you know, probably just even from the selection that we do at the conservatory, if you have shopped around or even in and out of garden centers and stores, there are just so many options out there. But let's start with some simple tips. So first and foremost, with flower bulbs, they really hate wet feet. So if you're looking for plants for a rain garden, this probably is not the best choice for you. That's the one thing about bulbs is they don't like a soil that has poor drainage or standing water. Your natives are really better suited for that. Bulbs there's some that can withstand, a wet spring, but if, you've got an area that, in the spring is consistently very wet, steer clear of those areas. I'll also mention, because I'm always thinking about snow in our winters and how that affects what we have in the ground, especially in our Chicago area. If you have beds next to driveways that use salt in the winter for ice, or even parkway beds next to street, you want to avoid beds where there's a lot of heavy snow plow accumulation that may have road salt in them from just over salting in the wintertime. And maybe not so necessarily like a walkway, but more where the snow plows come through and throw those big piles of snow and salt over your beds. The next bullet point I have is, and I like this quote, what's good for a tomato is not necessarily good for a bulb. And really what that means is bulbs don't need a lot of fresh compost and manure on top of them to establish. And actually, that richer soil like that, when you're planting to top dress, helps put on more top growth instead of root growth. So it's better to just plant your bulbs, tap them in, and let them be, and not cover them with like fresh compost or manure. I'm thinking, because I own chickens, like my chicken manure, I wouldn't throw that over my bulbs. I say that more for my vegetable gardens. And this is probably one of the most common questions that we get is, when can I plant my bulbs? And really with fall bulbs, you want to wait until what I say is you're in sweater weather. So 55 degrees, usually you wait for at least one killing frost, if not two, and then you can plant your bulbs. Narcissus are really the exception to that. They can be planted when the soil's a little warmer, around 60 degrees, but you want to wait till those hostas have kind of bit the dust out in the garden. The warm soil, if you plant them too early, it tells the bulb to start growing the top growth instead of sending down roots into the soil. And that's really what you want the bulb to do when you plant it in late fall. So there's a lot of bulbs out there now already. It seems like the retailers get fall going earlier and earlier. If you purchase your bulbs now, or if you're going to be picking them up next weekend from us, you just want to store them in a cool, dry spot. I think garages are great areas for that, or even a basement, just somewhere cool and dry with low humidity until you're ready to plant. Tulips, if you forget about them, which I know a lot of people do, I tend to do, I forget a bag that I put out in the garage. They can be planted really as late into January, really until as far as you can go is getting a shovel in the soil, as long as you can dig. They're a pretty tough bulb. So the last question that we get a lot of is, which way do I plant them? Which end is up? So you're going to look for the pointy tip of the bulb, and each bulb is different how they're shaped. And the end of the bulb has kind of a basal base to it. And sometimes when you get bulbs, especially narcissus, they'll have a few root hairs where the basal plate is. And packaging is generally pretty good nowadays. You can often just read the package and it'll tell you how far down to plant the bulb, pointed end up and root base down, and then just a nice firm soil when you plant it. It looks like I'm frozen here. Let's see here. Yeah, let's try this again.
Take advantage of this pause and submit some of your questions in the chat. I see quite a few coming in.
Judy, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I don't know how long I was gone for.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay. I was talking for a while and I'm not sure what you heard and what you did not.
No, we heard you. We're on slide 3. Are you on slide 3 with us?
Yeah. So we've gone over some simple tips and we'll kind of just touch on tools and equipments. And really what I will say, it's really a personal selection on what you feel comfortable using. There's the old-fashioned handheld bulb dibbers and augers. Just even a hand trowel works fine. Or if you're doing a larger planting, I've seen some drills fit with drill bits for planting tools. I know my guys like to use those out in the parks. Planting charts. So there are a lot of bulb planting charts out there. They're very beautiful. I think they're fun to look at. I thought this was a particularly good one from Burpee because it showed you not only the top growth and how tall things get, the different bulbs. It kind of grouped them into the early, mid, late spring section when they bloom. And then it also gives you a visual how deep to plant that bulb. General rule of thumb, is 3 to 4 inches of soil. But some bulbs do prefer to be planted a little deeper, such as narcissus. The size of the bulb, this used to be like a common thing. People said, oh, if it's a smaller bulb, you're going to plant it more at the surface, but that's not necessarily the case. I think the exception to that is Allium and Hyacinth are generally planted rather shallow. But most bulbs nowadays come with really good packaging telling you how deep to plant. Another kind of misnomer is, horticulture practices years ago used to mix in fertilizer and all kinds of stuff when you planted your bulb. Fertilizer is actually not necessary when planting bulbs, and it can do more damage to the bulb than good. So just a nice neutral pH soil is good for planting bulbs, which is, predominantly what we have around here. We don't have a lot of very acidic soil in our area unless you have a lot of evergreens, a lot of pine and large spruce trees like that you're going to be planting around. One thing that I will recommend when planting, no matter how deep you plant your bulb, is just make sure you tamp that soil down really good after planting. It helps discourage rodents from burrowing. And I've even seen some people use the chicken wire and whatnot over if they know they have a lot of problems with rodents, whether it's squirrels or whatnot digging. Honestly, if you wait late enough into fall when the soil's really getting cold before it's getting into the freeze to plant your bulbs, and just tamp it down really good. Don't plant like crocus are like one of the things that like squirrels love crocus. So save your crocus till as late as you can into late fall, even like into November or early December to plant your crocus. One thing I'll mention too is flower bulbs do everything in response to temperature, sunlight, and site conditions. The bloom times, they really vary, as well as the heights and the colors of the bulbs. They're affected by the temperature that happens in the spring. If it's a really warm spring, bulbs will bloom earlier. If it's a cold spring, they'll bloom later. If it's a long, cool spring, and then you have a period of rapid warming, which sometimes we tend to have, you might find really odd bloom times. And I think we're really starting to see that a lot these days, where it's like, okay, my crocus are blooming when my tulips are, and aren't those supposed to bloom first? And so, don't be surprised by that. It's nothing you've done wrong. Bulbs are really at the mercy of Mother Nature as to when they're going to bloom and do their thing. But they're very resilient and make a beautiful addition to a garden amongst perennials. And a lot of people, I think, have caught on to that, is interplanting bulbs amongst your perennials is a good thing to do. And actually the front of the conservatory is a majority native grasses that we have hundreds and hundreds of narcissus planted amongst those grasses. And it works out beautifully because in early spring, when those grasses are just starting to wake up, we have a beautiful showcase of daffodils that are, showcasing the front. And then as the warm weather goes on, the grasses tend to hide that dying foliage of the narcissus amongst them. Hosta are a great choice as well to help hide foliage from bulbs. And then for shade gardens, tulips make a great selection peppered in amongst shade perennials to add a burst of color. And, this can just be done very naturally, where, you pepper a handful of 5 to 6 tulips amongst your Bernera or your bleeding hearts. And even though, tulips tend to prefer more sun, generally that time of the year, the trees have not leafed out fully, so they'll still come up and do their show and work well in those types of conditions. So let's move on to bulb selection. I have 2 slides we're going to show you kind of quickly, talking about the different groupings of bulbs. The first slide really showcases those top 6 most common bulbs people know of: tulips, narcissus or daffodils, hyacinths, crocus, allium, and muscari, and their different bloom times. Tulips are the widest range of when they bloom. You can have species tulips that bloom very early spring, and more of the Darwin hybrid tulips that bloom very late spring. So you really could do a showcase of tulips that would carry you from early spring into virtually almost summer, when your peonies are starting to bloom and whatnot. But the other bulbs are so much fun that don't forget about those. The other grouping of bulbs on the next slide we have here are more of the specialty type bulbs. They're not as commonly seen, but don't let that fool you. They are very tough bulbs and can really withstand some tough conditions. So these are a great choice as well. Again, carrying you from very early spring to very late spring into summer. So we're going to dive kind of quickly into those different groupings. And this is kind of the fun part for me, is where I get to talk about my favorites, why I like them, and try to decipher, which I think is, can be overwhelming to people. Like, how do I pick? Which, do I pick just based on like the color and do I like it, or how do you pick, especially tulips? Just tulips alone. There are at least 8 different groupings of tulips. You have your single early tulips, your double early tulips, green tulips, which are less common, the lily flowering, fringe tulips or the parrot tulips, and then there's single late and species and mixtures, and just it goes on and on. But the top groupings that you most commonly see, especially in more of like a botanical setting, or more commonly see, is these 4 groupings that I have in front of you tonight. The Darwin hybrids are one of my favorite grouping of tulips. They're known for their huge, vibrant flowers on very strong stems. They tend to return year after year, which is great for a tulip. Parrot tulips are another great tulip, very exotic looking, really begs to be the star in your garden with its showy fringe scallop foliage, and it's just a very flamboyant late blooming tulip, large blooms, makes a great cut flower. Double late tulips are another one that a lot of people, it's one of our one groupings of tulips that tends to sell out first, because they resemble peonies, and they're just such a unique, distinct tulip. They are very late blooming. They have long lasting blooms. I have some Angelique double tulips planted in my front yard, and I swear they go for 2-3 weeks that I get good blooms off of them. And then the last grouping of tulips is the Triumph tulips, and they're really a cross between a Darwin hybrid and an early tulip. So you get them blooming a little bit earlier than you would a Darwin hybrid. And they're known for, again, like the Darwin hybrid, that really strong stem, huge flower, but you get a little bit earlier bloom time with the Darwin hybrids. So some of my favorite tulips, and it's hard to pick because they're, each is so unique, but I really appreciate these 4 that we're carrying in our online sale collection this year. Banjaluka is a very old tulip. It's actually a sport of, if you remember, Appledorn tulip. It's a jewel tone tulip, has huge flowers, marigold yellow color, bright ruby featherings and petals. It's just a really striking tulip. Pink impression and apricot impression, those are 2. I think last year we sold out 2 or 3 times of those 2 varieties. This year I tried to order a lot more to begin with, but it's an award winner. It remains probably, those 2 tulips remain one of the most highly regarded tulips. They were introduced in 1979 and just are an outstanding selection for your garden. Apricot impression has really a varying shade of like a smoldering tangerine orange, kind of a nasturtium red color to it. It's just a beautiful giant tulip. Orange Van Eyck too. The Van Eyck tulips are super popular. I planted them a lot in the parks, like up at Scoville. We've done a lot of Van Eyck mixtures. Orange Van Eyck is a newer one, has a bright coral orange flower. Again, really long lasting. I'm finding that the orange and the peachy colored tulips, even though a lot of people tell me I don't like orange whenever I sit down and do a design for them, those orange tulips are really hot nowadays. It's just such a nice bright color. Don Quixote, this is one I actually forgot about. Last year I rediscovered it. It's circa 1979, and it's a cross between a Darwin and an early tulip. And I did order these last year for the sale, and they just sold out so quickly. And I did plant some myself last fall, and they were beautiful in the garden this spring. It has huge, deep rose blooms, and it's just almost kind of a glistening sheen to it. It's one, again, that you have to see in person. So I could talk forever about tulips, but we're going to move on to narcissus, which is a very confusing group, I think, for people. Narcissus, daffodils, jonquils, commonly the narcissus are referred to as daffodils or jonquils. It's all the same groupings. They all belong to the horticulture genus of narcissus, which is actually broken down into 12 divisions by the Royal Horticulture Society. So we're going to go over those different divisions and how to choose your daffodils. Really, I don't think you can go wrong with the selection of daffodils that we have out there, but I definitely want to touch on some of my favorites. So like I mentioned, there's 12 divisions of daffodils. Trumpet daffodils, large cup, small cup, double, triandrous, cyclameneus, jonquil, tazita. Tazita is actually, what is it at the holiday time that we force? I'm blanking out what it is. The very fragrant.
The paper white?
The paper whites. Yep. That is the species of that variety. Poeticus, miniature, split cup, and then there's naturalizing mixtures. So of all the thousands of different daffodils that are out there, they're split amongst one of these divisions. My 4 favorites that I love, that I think is a must in every garden, are Tahiti. Tahiti is a daffodil from 1956. It's been around. It's a award winner. It has large 4-inch wide double yellow, soft yellow flower with a double cup inset with that just beautiful tangerine orange in the center. Alliums are typically coming into bloom after the tulips and daffodils and around the same time in the peonies. So this makes a nice mixture in there. Butterfly mixture is another great one. That's one we often sell out of right away. So every year I seem to order more and more of that particular variety. It has a really neat split cup mixture where it has that double petal in the center. One thing I'll mention about butterfly mixture is you get 1 flower per stem and 1 stem per bulb with that. So sometimes that surprises people. With daffodils, you often get multiple stems per bulb, but that variety, if you want a big showing of it that first year, you want to plant that a little denser. But like most daffodils, it multiplies, comes up year after year. So you're going to be multiplying that over the years. Mount Hood is probably one of my favorite daffodils. I'm always buying several cases of that for the parks just to do some nice big drifts of Mount Hood. It is a trumpet daffodil, has a very large, bold flower. It's a prized heirloom, circa 1937. So this one is a really tried and true daffodil. A glistening ivory white bloom to it. I have a lot of white in my garden, and this one just almost has like a pale lemony yellow to the center of it. It's just such a beautiful daffodil. And then the last grouping of daffodils is the poeticus, or the poet daffodil. This one I have not had a lot of experience with, but is one of the most intriguing to me. It's a true heirloom. It's the oldest member of the flower kingdom amongst daffodils. So there's some history to it, and it's the closest to the wild form of daffodils. I did order this one last year for a sale. It sells out extremely quickly when you're ordering your bulbs from Netherlands. It's one that you've got to get right on if you want to carry that one. And unfortunately, we did not. I ordered and they sold out before they had got my order. So I'm hoping to bring that one back because it's just such a beautiful daffodil, a lot of great history behind it. All right, so daffodils, and we're going to move on to more of the specialty bulbs. And I've grouped these together, no rhyme or reason, but just to kind of group them and keep us moving. Let's talk a little bit about allium and hyacinths. Allium, as you may know, is Latin for garlic, and it has that oniony smell. They're available in diverse heights and sizes. They typically are rabbit and rodent resistant, very late bloomer, and very seldom affected by disease. They are popping up when your late spring and early summer perennials are starting to get going. They're adored by the bees and butterflies and pollinators, and they really extend that bloom time. And I think they're just a fun bulb to plant among summer or late spring perennials as they pop up and do their thing with other perennials at their base. Hyacinths are much loved by happy bumblebees in the spring, I would say. They're very deer and rodent resistant. The original species was actually found in the wild in the Eastern Mediterranean all the way back in 1562. They have a very strong perfume odor. And one thing I will say, I want to kind of troubleshoot maybe any issues that you may have had with these, is if your hyacinth is yielding more foliage than flowers, it normally indicates there's like a root system issue. Particularly like the first of spring, if you're getting like a lot of green foliage and you're not seeing, that beautiful, vibrant flower popping up, it typically is a sign that either you need to divide these, or perhaps, look at kind of your fertilizer that you have going on, and make sure you're not over fertilizing even throughout the season where you have bulbs planted. One thing too, I will mention about hyacinths, if you've ever volunteered and helped us with our bulb sale, I often tell the volunteers, wear gloves when you're handling hyacinths. Some people have a very allergic, itchy reaction to the bulb. I'm one that does, and even just being around them, sometimes my face will start itching and I'll just start, I'm itching just thinking about it now. So yeah, that's one word of advice. Some people it does not bother, but some people you do get kind of an itchy reaction to the hyacinth bulb. All right, how are we doing here on time? I think pretty good. We've got, I think, about 4 more slides. So we're going to finish with the last 3 grouping of specialty bulbs, and then talk a little bit about bulbs and pollinators. And I'll open it up to you for all of your questions. So our second to the last grouping of specialty bulbs are muscari, crocus, cayenne, and scilla. Beautiful. All 3 or 4 actually have beautiful blue flowers, and it's very rare to get a true blue flower like you do from some of these bulbs. Now they do come in some varying shades, especially the crocus. You can get yellow mammoth and a mixture there. But muscari is probably one of the few varieties of flower bulbs that you'll notice after you plant in the fall. It sends up like extra rounds of tufts of foliage. a few weeks after you plant it, especially if you plant it early enough. Don't let that bother you. It's natural. You really don't need to do anything about that or worry about it. If you're going to mulch over where you plant muscari or grape hyacinths, you don't want to plant any more than, or you don't want to cover them any more than a 2-inch layer of mulch over them, really until after the surface of the ground freezes. If you notice, because grape hyacinths, they are just one of those that comes back year after year after year, that after you've had them several years and you're starting to yield more foliage than flowers, again, it's generally a sign that, you know, you've got a mature planting. In the fall, dig it up, divide it, transplant it, give some to a neighbor, and then just plant it back to its original depth, just to give a little bit more spacing for the roots of that bulb. Sometimes they tend to strangle themselves, but they're a great bulb. Crocus, I think I mentioned this earlier. Sadly, squirrels and chipmunks, they love to eat crocus corms, and they may dig up a newly planted corm for an immediate snack, or for a hidden transplant somewhere other than you planted. Try to outsmart the squirrels by planting the crocus later, shortly before the ground freezes. Like I mentioned, sometimes people do the mesh chicken wire over the top and then remove that after the ground freezes. That's fine to do. And you don't see it as often now, but people used to plant crocus in their lawns, which is great. I would recommend that you look for more of a species crocus for the lawn, because they bloom about 2 weeks earlier than like a Dutch flowering crocus. The corms are smaller and easier to plant in the lawn. So look for a species crocus if you want to do kind of a nice display in your lawn of crocus. Glory of the snow. This is one of spring's early bloomers. And that's that picture up in the middle above the word muscari. And it has just vivid sky blue flowers on strong stems. It's circa 1796. So this is one that has been around. It's really terrific, planted in mass in a garden border. I've seen it like the muscari planted as a river. We have actually up at Scoville Park, a long river of them, kind of in this right off Lake Street, and they're beautiful. Scilla are the last one in this group that I want to talk about, and that one has been around a while as well, back in the 1700s. Has that vivid sky blue flower on a strong stem. You see them a lot on like a woodland floor, but really you see them everywhere. And it's probably one we get the most calls about when people start seeing it bloom in early spring, because if they're happy where they're planted, they can naturalize both by the bulb and the offset and the baby bulbs and really just take over. University of Minnesota does warn against these, that while they're not on the invasive list in our area, you know, it's one to keep in mind, and really right plant, right place. So this is not one that I would necessarily plant amongst my native spring ephemerals, because they do tend to take over. I've seen them in lawns, and they work beautifully in lawns. Again, they're just one of those that's just very self-sowing. We have them that were planted many years ago, I believe by a group of gardeners in Austin Gardens, when there used to be a group of gardeners that used to take care of Austin Gardens that were planted there, and they've taken over. And so we have to keep them in check so that they aren't choking out some of our native ephemerals like our mayaples, and some of the other great, the trillium and whatnot that we have up there. So we'll move on to, and we've got about 15 minutes left and just a couple more slides. So we'll have time for questions. Okay, so this is the last grouping of specialty bulbs. Fritillaria, gallanthus, and licorice. Fritillaria, I think, is the one that scares people the most. That's what's pictured on the screen there with the yellow and the bright orange flowers. Fritillaria, it's just such an interesting grouping of bulbs. And so fritillaria have really a wide range of different heights and sizes and shapes of the flower, but most flowers are like a bell-shaped flower on a very thin, wiry stem. The degree of compaction between the florets really varies. So you can see in the small picture up above the word fritillaria, there's some whites and some beautiful wine red ones that are a little bit more dainty. And so they're a fun bulb. One thing I will say is they are a bit more finicky than other flower bulbs. They don't like being out of the soil for long. So that's one that's like the first one I would plant if I would purchase. I just get them in the ground. And then if you move them, just know that you can move them, but you want to move them and transplant them right away. Plant the fritillaria bulbs pretty deep, 6 to 7 inches, and about 8 to 10 inches apart. Smaller fritillaria, of course, you're going to plant a little shallower, 5 to 6 inches, 5 to 6 inches apart. But again, packaging, will tell you how low, how deep to plant them. Gallanthus, also referred to as snowdrops, again, another bulb that's been around for quite a while. Let's see, I lost my screen here. There we go. Here we go. They're referred to as snowdrops, and one of the first that you see, even before the daffodils, they're award winner bulb. They have beautiful, bright, white, delicate flower, and shiny green foliage. It's just a nice kind of burst of spring. Generally, you see them as the witch hazels are blooming, have a really droopy, milky white flower. They are deer and road resistant, and they naturalize pretty readily. And this is the one bulb that is more tolerant of wet soil and a bit of moisture than the other bulbs. I think if you remember from the beginning, I said, you're looking for plants for a rain garden, bulbs aren't the great choice, but I do have snowdrops planted in my backyard, where I have like a dry stream bed kind of around the dry stream bed, where we do tend to get a little bit more water as the spring, thaws with the snow, and they do quite well there. Move my screen down. Surprise lily, that's our last grouping. And I'm hoping the lady is on here that has called us in the past about surprise lilies. Surprise lilies are the latest to bloom, and they are really kind of like a late spring, early summer. They're known as naked lilies. I've heard every different name for them. They really surprise you when they come up, because it's like, wow, what is that blooming so late? And the leaves die back in the summer, but it's that pink lilac flower. It's been around forever in the amaryllis family, and just a fun bulb to plant, have a little late surprise in the summer come up. Well, that's taken us through our specialty bulbs. And the next thing I'll mention is bulbs for pollinators. Let's see here if I can get that slide going. All right, so bulbs for pollinators. You know, you don't often think about flower bulbs for pollinators, but when the pollinators, you know, awaken, you know, from winter, they're literally starving. And well, I love to plant natives and have that choice for them. I think there's something to be said about bulbs with their interesting flower. There are some very nectar-rich bulbs out there that I like to plant for my pollinators. Species tulips are a great selection. Critillaris, I have a lot of critillaris in my shade garden. Muscari, allium for like a late spring. They love allium. So just something to consider, you know. Dutch flower bulbs, you know, the ones that are come across the seas to us are grown in accordance with very stringent floricultural and environmental restrictions in all of Europe. It's a very strict policy that they have. And the flower bulbs that we receive are bee friendly. They can't contain no neonicotinoid residue whatsoever. So they are safe for your pollinators. Everything that I've read and kind of read up on that quite a bit, especially when you're buying something, you know, across seas. You want to know, okay, how are they treating, you know, their plants and their bulbs that we're bringing across here to plant into our gardens. Okay, so I'm just going to end on the history of bulbs. You know, honestly, I could do like a whole presentation on the history of bulbs. There's just such a fascinating group. They have a rich history. There's so many wild stories about bulbs. If you've ever heard of tulip mania, different symbolisms, connections to economics, to class, even to religion. There's a lot of actually great literature and reading out there if you're a history buff. I like planting bulbs mainly because of, you know, having that connection to history. And, you know, if you've ever visited areas out on the East Coast, more of the historical monuments, bulb planting is very big on the East Coast. And some of our largest bulb company suppliers are home based in the East Coast of the United States. So it's a great place to visit in the springtime and learn about the history of bulbs and view some more of the historical bulbs that have been around here for a long time. But I'm going to end it on there because I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Thank you all for joining me tonight. Like Judy had mentioned at the beginning, we have our fall mum and bulb sale going online until this coming Monday, and there's a good selection left. And I'm here to answer any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Patti. What a fantastic presentation, very educational, and how fortunate we are to have the director of horticulture for the Oak Park Conservatory here, and great timing with fall being just around the corner as well. So we do have a number of questions in the chat. I will start right at the top here. So Ken had some great questions for you, starting with how would one keep bulbs after they bloom and begin to die down? Would you recommend replanting in another place in the garden, or just drying and storing for the fall?
So if you're talking about, you know, in the spring, they've bloomed and you're wanting to transplant them or remove them, depending on the bulb, most like just to stay put where they are or to be transplanted right away. You're not going to have a lot of success digging them and saving them until next fall to replant them. So a lot of times I recommend is, you know, if you dig them, replant them right away, find a new home for them. Typically what we've done, like in the parks, when we've dug tulips for in the spring after they're done blooming, we bring them back to the conservatory and we dry them out actually in an empty greenhouse on just like brown paper sheeting, and just let them get really dry, remove the soil from them so that there's no like moisture there. And then we bag them in brown paper bags. And then, you know, people will take them home and plant them in their garden. But, you know, I've had some people get them and then wait until fall to plant them. And they've either, you know, they've not stored them in a dry enough location. So just plant them right away if you can.
Great. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo on myself, but okay, no, it went away. Ken also had a question. I know you touched a little bit on soil and fertilizers. Ken's wondering if it's beneficial to use a blood meal when planting bulbs.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fine to do. I know, like my mother, she always used to plant lots of bulbs, and she just always swear by, you know, using blood meal. I don't know. I'm generally scurrying to get them in before the ground freezes, because I'm one of those that I wait. So I never have, and it's never impacted my bulbs in my home.
Sure, got it. Thank you. And on that note, Ken was also wondering, how late can you plant bulbs? Is it really just until the soil is too frozen and hard, or is there kind of a cutoff?
No, I mean, until the soil's too frozen and hard. I've been out there. I do remember one year I was out there on New Year's Day planting my bulbs, and I thought, this is so awesome to be gardening on New Year's Day. So you can plant them pretty late. The one thing I would recommend though is make sure you're planting them deep enough and that you're just taking your foot and walking over the top of them, because that ground's going to freeze and thaw. And, you know, even try to give them a drink of water too. That's one thing, like after I plant my bulbs, I give them a nice little drink of water, just like I do all the rest of my plants in my garden before they go to sleep for the winter.
Sure, that's really helpful. And that does sound like a great New Year's Day. So thank you for that. How about, so in terms of the ground temperature, is that really the same thing as the weather temperature that we all look for in the weekly weather? Or is there a tool that you recommend for ground temperature?
No, and don't let that scare you. You don't have to go out there and measure the temperature of your soil. It's too hot now. We know that, right? It's been in the 80s. It's hot. I think the first sign is, have we had a frost yet? Are my perennials, like my hostas, wilty and getting icky? Then it's time to plant. A soil temperature is not the same as the ambient air temperature.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And we had a couple questions about squirrels. So I think you said a couple times really that planting later is key, really pushing down the soil, and even, chicken wire or chicken mesh has been used. Is there anything else that you might recommend, or is that kind of, what folks should look for?
I know people have used like there is repellent that you can purchase. I think it's hard to use that in the fall because we tend to get more rains. There's more dew in the morning, so you have to reapply it more often. The rodent repellent spray, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I don't use it. I generally just plant enough. So if I see some of them being nibbled on, I'm okay with that. But yeah, I think just planting them deep enough, waiting. Generally, the squirrels have had their fill of acorns and whatnot by the time you go to plant them.
Got it. That makes sense. And then can you explain the lasagna method of spring bulb planting and share your opinion about it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this is one that scares people too. They're like, really, can I do this? And actually, I don't know if you can go back to it. If not, that's okay. I'm gonna go back to it on my screen so I can reference it. The bulb planting chart, there are so many great bulb planting charts out there, and just referring to like a good bulb planting chart for the different depths of bulbs and how to plant them. Like for instance, you know, a narcissus, you plant fairly deep. So I tend to plant on top of that, like my hyacinths, so that they're either blooming one after another or about the same time, depending on which I have selected. So that's very common to do. Actually, we're going to do a lasagna method this year up at Scoville Park, which we tend to plant like the main center beds, where we do annuals, which is all tulips. But this year, we're going to be interplanting different layers of several different species of daffodils and tulips, several different species layers of tulips. So we have more of a longer continuous bloom from very early spring on. So I'm excited about that. And you're more than welcome to come volunteer with us once we do that. We can show you how we do that. Just contact us. We used to have a lot of volunteers come out and help us plant bulbs. We don't do as many in the parks as we used to. We have a lot of native and natural areas, but Scoville and Austin Gardens, the Conservatory, are three of our main areas that we do tend to have a large display of bulbs in the spring.
Perfect. Thank you for walking through that, and very interesting. And definitely, if you have some extra time, volunteering is a great way to learn and get involved in your community as well. Let's see. Okay, another squirrel question. I think we've touched on that. And then, what do you do with the dead foliage? Amy here has heard that braiding the leaves. Has heard of braiding the leaves or cutting them when they turn brown. But what do you recommend?
Yeah, if you have that time on your hands, you can do that. That's very beautiful. I know that's the Martha Stewart technique. I actually, when I first started working for the Conservatory and we were doing bulb planting on the parks, I had someone ask me, "Are you going to braid on those?" It would have taken us forever. But it depends on the bulb. For the most part, you want to leave that foliage in place at least a few weeks after they bloom, or when you can it's starting to really get wilty, not much life left into it. You don't have to wait for it to totally brown, but it's kind of like faded. It's not quite green, it's kind of yellowing. Then it's just not producing a lot of photosynthesis. So go ahead. Don't wait for it to, to totally turn brown. Cut it back. But that's really why I like to plant them amongst perennials, where you could braid them or tuck them back. I have, kind of not braided them, but like folded them over and taken like a sod pin or whatnot, and just kind of tuck them back so they're not all over the place. That works well.
Great. Yep, that's really helpful to know. And then another question here. So you hinted that some tulips return. Do all tulips return, or are there some that do not?
So they all mostly tend to return, but some varieties return better than others. Species tulips tend to be the longest lived, return year after year after year. We have many at Cheney Mansion, or we did it one time actually. I don't know how many we have left there. They are ones that, like, I think a few years ago when we had that polar vortex, they just didn't survive as well as some of our other tulips did. They do a little bit better in more of a southern climate, but species tulips are very long living. The Darwin hybrid, they're the next grouping. Generally, if you can get 2 or 3 years out of your tulip bulbs where they perform well for you, that's great. But I mean, I've had some tulips, like I've lived in the house where we're at now for, oh gosh, 11, 12 years. And I have tulips that were here when we moved in. They don't bloom as well as the others do. So they still come back. It's just a matter of they're sending more energy into growing larger leaves than they are big, beautiful flowers. So then you just know, okay, I'm getting more leaf than I am flower. So let's replace these now. So, but 2 to 3 years, I think Darwin hybrid, you can get more. You can probably get 3 to 4 years out of those.
And then do bulbs multiply, and do you need to thin them? So if they're in the ground for, you know, several years, at what point do you think you need to thin them?
Depends on the bulbs. So some multiply more readily than others. Most do multiply. Narcissus, you know, they for sure multiply pretty readily. Crocus is one that I don't think multiplies as much. I feel like, and this probably goes back to that squirrel issue, they're not as long-lived. They tend to get disturbed more. Some species of tulips will multiply, some will not. But most of your bulbs do multiply. And then what was the second part of that question?
And just, do you need to thin them?
So yeah, when you notice that they're sending out more green leaves, like muscari is a good example of that. Even hyacinths are a really good example of that. When they're sending out more green leaves and smaller flower, dividing those because their roots are really starting to get tangled. And that kind of goes true with iris as well. Once you know you're getting more foliage than blooms, that's a sign that, okay, I need to divide these.
Great, very helpful information. Thank you, Patti. And we just have one question left, and I think it may be a great one to wrap up on. Unless there's anything else, of course, please feel free to put that in the chat. But so you touched on some of your favorite, different varieties, but what types would you recommend for a beginner? What are the most forgiving?
They're all pretty easy. Don't overthink it, for sure. I mean, especially if you're out there like me, when it's freezing cold with mittens on, just trying to get them in the ground. Sometimes I'm just planting them so fast. They find their way to the surface. They really do. Daffodils, that's a good starter one, and it's very rewarding because it tends to come back year after year. And so you feel successful with the daffodil, right? And it's the first one you see coming up in the spring outside of like the snowdrops and whatnot. Tulips are pretty easy as well. I don't think you can go wrong with any of them. Fritillaria, I think that's the one. I have planted one variety of fritillaria, but more of the larger tropicals I haven't planted because they scare me, but I'm going to try them this year and I'll let you know how they do.
Please do. Please do. Well, I'm going to wrap us up here. Casey, thank you for running the Q&A, and to Patti, thank you so much for taking your time to do this. I know how busy you are and that your days never end, and you wake up before dawn. And so I'm so grateful for you taking the time to do this. And every time I hear you present, I always learn something new and get more inspiration. And I'm sure the audience here today feels the same way. So thank you for doing that presentation for us tonight. And you guys are a great audience. Everybody is wonderful, and your questions were fantastic. So have a good evening, and we look forward to seeing you when you pick up your plants and at the sale coming up next Friday. And we'll see you hopefully for the chili pepper talk in early October. Okay, guys, have a good evening.
Great.